Hi geographers, welcome to your cat help video this week for the fifth hazards cat that you've got to complete. We have a 20-mark question this week. And the question says, the severity of the impacts of the volcanic hazards experienced in a place is affected more by the nature of plate boundaries than the level of development of the place. And then we need to discuss the extent to which we agree with this view. So we spend a little bit of time just unpicking maybe what this question's asking us to do, and then we'll look at the sort of structure you may wish to follow for this answer. So this question is about volcanic hazards primarily. So we need to make sure that we're not making reference to any other type of natural hazard in this answer. We just want to be thinking about volcanoes, and in particular about the severity of the impacts of volcanoes, how bad they are when they erupt. This could be determined by one of two things. It could be determined by the nature of plate boundaries, i.e. are they destructive plate boundaries with explosive eruptions, or are they constructive plate boundaries with effusive eruptions? So we need to think, are volcanic eruptions hazardous and have lots of impacts? Is that because of the way the volcano erupts in terms of whether it's explosive or effusive? Or is it more down to the level of development in terms of whether it's a high-income country, a newly emerging economy, a low-income country, and then all of the associated elements that go along with that in terms of the preparation and planning and management of that hazard. So really, before you go anywhere, you need to make a decision. You need to decide which way you think this goes. Okay, you could argue it either way, but it's important that you choose a side here. Okay, this is not just about regurgitating lots of facts about case studies. It's about you actually thinking about your opinion of this statement. Okay, so once you've decided where you're going, you can start to think about maybe a kind of plan for this answer. And I've kind of jotted a bit of a plan down here for you, which you're welcome to follow. So the first thing I would want to do, a paragraph which gives a little bit of intro. It sort of sets the scene to this response. So within that, I'd want to unpick some of the key terminology. Yeah, like what do I mean by nature of plate boundaries? What do we mean by level of development? What are volcanic hazards? So unpick a little bit of that key terminology. Don't need to write loads for this, but it's important to just clarify what some of those terms mean. And then I always think it's a really good idea at this point to sort of state your viewpoint. Overall, do you agree or disagree with that statement? Are you swaying more towards the nature of plate boundaries, or are you swaying more towards the level of development? Or do you think it's a combination of the two with a little bit more emphasis on one than the other? So when you've done that, you then want to think about building up the main body of your answer. Now, this question lends itself to a kind of split in terms of one part focusing on the nature of plate boundaries, and another part focusing on the level of development. So in your first point, and I've said point, and this might be more than one paragraph here, this is where you could maybe present that argument for the viewpoint in terms of how the nature of plate boundaries affects the impacts. Within this, you want to make sure you're giving a nice clear explanation of how constructive plate boundaries tend to produce effusive eruptions, and also an explanation of how destructive plate boundaries produce explosive eruptions. So you need to be able to explain how the type of lava influences the nature of those eruptions. You want to make sure that you're backing that up with examples and evidence, so you can hopefully link that back to some of the examples we've looked at in lessons and maybe ones that you've researched yourself, and think about trying to just have an example of where a constructive plate boundary has produced an effusive, gentle eruption, and that's not had much of an impact, and maybe a destructive plate boundary has produced an explosive eruption, which has had quite a significant impact. And that kind of ticks off that one side of the argument. You then want to think about the second point, which is your kind of argument against the viewpoint. So your argument that actually levels of development are more important. So within this point, or within these paragraphs, you might want to think about the fact that impacts are less significant in high income countries. Yeah, maybe you could explain why high income countries suffer less at the hands of volcanic eruptions, and why low income countries or newly emerging economies, why they tend to suffer more. And that could be things that happen before the eruption in terms of preparation, could be things that happen during the eruption in terms of management, or it could be things that happen after the eruption in terms of recovery. With this, you want to make sure that you're backing up your points with examples. So you can definitely bring in Eyjafjallajökull in Iceland, a good example of where the impacts are not that significant in a high income country. You could use maybe Nyiragongo as an example of how the impacts could be quite significant in a low income country, or maybe Mount Merapi if that's one that you've researched. But make sure that you're supplementing your points with examples and evidence. Then towards the end of your answer, it might make sense, and this might form part of your conclusion, but you want to maybe have a little bit of a twist in your answer. You want to think about maybe where the situation isn't quite as clear cut as that question makes it seem. Okay, so the best geographers out there will say, okay, yeah, you could argue it to be plate boundaries, or you could argue it to be level of development, but actually in the real world it's not necessarily that straightforward. So you might, for example, be able to think of an eruption that's had quite significant impacts in high income countries, or eruptions in low income countries that haven't had very severe impacts. So you might be able to kind of have a little bit of a twist within your answer there. And again, that might form part of your conclusion, or if you feel like you've got quite a lot to say on that, that could be a kind of third point in your answer. Then on to the conclusion. It's really important that you come to a decision about the statement. It does say, if we just scroll quickly back up to the question, to what extent do you agree with this view? So really you need to use the word extent, don't you, within your answer, or certainly the word agree within your answer. So really you should either be strongly or partially agreeing, or strongly or partially disagreeing with that statement. You shouldn't be absolutely in the middle of that seesaw, and you shouldn't really be totally agreeing or totally disagreeing. You should be somewhere towards one side, maybe a little bit further along one side than another, but you want to be coming down on one side or the other. Don't sit on the fence in the middle. However, you might show an awareness that sometimes it is a combination of the two factors that are coming into play. So that kind of sums up the sort of broad structure that you might want to use. As a general reminder, thinking about the amount that you're expected to write for these 20 markers, you have about kind of 20 minutes, half an hour in the exam to do them. So realistically, a couple of sides of A4 handwritten. I know many of you will be typing them at the moment, and that's fine. So one side of A4 typed in a kind of normal size font, so a sort of size 11 font, something like that, is about what you'd be expected to write. You don't need to write more than that because that's unrealistic in terms of what you'd have time to do in the exam. You want to make sure that you consider different scales if you can. So some of those impacts might be local, some of them might be global, some of them might be short or long term. So you can show that awareness of different scales within your answer. As I've said all along, it's important that you are building an argument and that you decide where you're going before you set off. Otherwise, the danger is that you just lapse into giving very, very descriptive accounts of what has happened in a volcanic eruption, rather than presenting an argument about why that eruption was so bad or not. And it's probably worth pointing out here that the case study of Eyjafjallajökull on its own is not enough to answer this question fully. You certainly wouldn't have the breadth of examples if you just focused on Eyjafjallajökull. So I know we've used that as a sort of depth case study, but you were asked when we were studying this to be looking at some additional examples. I've mentioned a few already, but Mount Nyiragongo, Mount Merapi, Mount Ontake in Japan, White Island in New Zealand, Krakatoa in Indonesia. They're all good examples which you can use, which will give a little bit of a different spin to the Eyjafjallajökull case study that we've used together.